Kathy. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you this evening, Michael Martinez. I met Michael at the Natural History Museum. I think it was 2013, right about the time that he was just getting started with LA Compost. And the gardens, the nature gardens at the museum were actually, if we hadn't already opened, we were getting close to opening when we connected with him, actually through, I think, Richard Hayden, who was the head gardener at the time, another member of the Hort Society, and now the director of the Nature Gardens. Anyway, Michael and LA Compost did some classes for us at the Natural History Museum, and over the years, I've watched from a distance how he has grown this organization from a very small group of mostly volunteers into a really thriving, dynamic nonprofit that has hubs all over the LA area, helping people learn how to make their own compost and to provide composting opportunities. And he's going to tell us all about what he has done. And just a tiny little bit about Michael, besides his current work. He used to be an elementary school teacher. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that. I'm not sure what classes he taught. And he also is a certified master gardener. So he has a very solid background in horticulture in addition to his work with LA Compost. So please welcome Michael. Take it away.
Thank you, Carol. How nice it is to come kind of full circle and reconnect almost 10 years later and just to reflect and remember our early beginnings and just kind of be in a state of gratitude for just all the love and support we received from partners across the city over the past few years. Thank you, everyone. I will be sharing my screen because I have a little presentation, because compost pictures are always a lot nicer to look at than me. And yeah, I'll do my best to answer a lot of your questions towards the end of this kind of talk. And for any questions I don't get to, I will be happy to respond via email or figure out a way to just create some clarity for anything that is still unclear. The goal of today's talk is to kind of talk about community and climate resiliency through the lens of compost. And LA Compost, as a nonprofit we are, our mantra and our ethos really is soil and people. And I would say that the beginning portion of this conversation is going to focus on soil. And I also understand that the audience I am speaking to is very engaged and knowledgeable about soil. So I'm not going to spend too much time teaching about like compost itself. I mean, I'll speak of the ins and outs and intricacies of the soil food web and ingredients and so on. But many of you, I'm sure, are active composters, are experienced composters, and can add a lot to this conversation, I'm sure, as well. I'll just start off by saying the beauty of compost in many ways is just really how it showcases this full story of food, how it shows that there's no such thing as away, there's no such thing as waste, but that food scraps can in fact be a part of this closed loop system. There's a lot of conversation as far as where food comes from, how it's grown, how it's labeled, but how can we continue the conversation in regards to what happens after the table experience? And how can we ensure that food scraps are viewed as resources and nutrients that can return back to our soils, back to our neighborhoods, as opposed to shipped far away and not seeing them again? So to start off, I kind of want to talk about just compost and its definition. I mean, there's plenty of definitions out there. This is a picture of one of our kind of community hubs at a park. It's a windrow process. But for many of us, we have different definitions of composting. The composting I'm going to be speaking on today is essentially composting in aerobic conditions with air. It's when organic matter is processed and decomposed by microorganisms, transforming raw materials such as leaves, grass clippings, garden trimmings, food scraps, animal manure, and ag residues into compost, which is essentially a valuable earth-smelling soil amendment teeming with life. I want to just say that composting is a managed process done with intention, speeding up decomposition process, because we're all aware that When these trees drop their leaves, they naturally decompose, but composting in an urban environment is essentially done with intention and really speeding up this decomposition process by creating these environmental conditions to take place. It improves conservation of nutrients, mitigates potential pollution from just concentrated nutrients and pathogens in the raw organic material being processed, and essentially has global impacts in addition to the local impacts in terms of returning carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients to the ecosystem. This process is aerobic, meaning there's presence of oxygen and oxygen-loving organisms. There's fast and complete decomposition control biologically. There's higher temps needed to kill the pathogens and weed seeds, and minimal odors when we're really processing and turning on a frequent basis, as you see here. These piles get turned weekly across various piles across the city. And we've even implemented some forced aeration piles where there's a timer, a blower fan, and air that kind of is forced below the pile into the pile to allow for the aerobic loving organisms to thrive and multiply. And then there's physical changes in compost, of course. Finished compost bears little resemblance to the raw parent material being composted. From brown to a kind of black, dark cacao color, particles reduce in size, and you get this humus-like final ingredient, which is this stable form of decomposed organic matter that can be used and applied to many of your gardens, which I'm sure many of you are. There's various types of composting bins. Many of you have used plenty of these, and this little picture right here actually is in the courtyard at the Natural History Museum of one of our past workshops in the past. There's plastic bins, as we've seen, being offered and distributed across many city and county workshops, which is kind of the residential use and kind of a lasagna method, slow static compost that doesn't really generate a lot of heat. Wire bins, as we see here, are really simple to make, really inexpensive, typically drive out a little quicker than most bins, but can hold a lot of material, easy to access, easy to water, and easy to just process. Tumblers are also a nice system that many people use. It's off the ground, kind of rodent proof per se, but also a few air vents kind of, you might have trouble in terms of just balancing the moisture. Every system has its pro and con for sure. Wooden and pallet bins, which you kind of utilize and what you'll see later in the presentation, are systems that kind of focus on this 3-tier process where there's an in bin, a cooking bin, and a curing bin. I kind of like to use the analogy of like baking, where this is where you're gathering your ingredients, mixing it with the Vitamix or KitchenAid, I apologize. This is when it's in the oven, and this is when it's on the counter, on the shelf, cooling off. Worm bins are a different type of composting. They're very much not thermophilic. They want to be below 80 degrees and very much can operate in a small footprint and are ideal in dark, shady, cool areas. And then my favorite are just like no bins and just kind of covered piles where there's a balance of ingredients, optimum conditions for no rodents, vermin, or anything to interact or engage with this pile, but is optimal for community engagement and multiple hands and individuals to participate in this work. Real simple snapshot that we like to use. Obviously, my 5th grade teacher background will probably be seen in a lot of my work for the foreseeable future. But I like to say that composting is a lot like baking. Having never baked in my life, what I've seen bakers do is they gather ingredients, create conditions, create environment for something to happen. And that's what composting is. We're gathering ingredients, we're creating environmental conditions for something to happen. The 2 primary ingredients of our piles typically come in the form of what we call browns and greens. And I apologize, this is a review for many of you, but basically our carbon and nitrogen sources, not just things that are green or brown in color, but items that are basically the protein and the energy for our soil food web, our microorganisms. Some examples of brown items are our mulch and wood chips, our dead leaves, sawdust from untreated wood, twigs, newspaper, shredded paper, and unbleached paper towels. Here in Los Angeles, which I'll get to in a little bit, we LA Compost work with a variety of partners to source our browns. Work with local arborists and tree trimmers. We work with local woodworkers such as Angel City Lumber, which is a local organization in Northeast LA that gathers fallen trees and repurposes them for tables and floors and deck siding and all these beautiful repurposed materials. And they produce about 20 yards of sawdust a month. And rather than that going to landfill, we collect and redistribute across our network of hubs. Greens, there's plenty of greens in the form of fruits and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, tea leaves, eggshells, which is an interesting one because it's calcium, kind of a unique ingredient that you'll find in your compost piles for several years. Green leaves, grass trimmings, old flowers, just a few snapshot of the ingredients. Plenty more in terms of what the full spectrum of composting is. I like to always say that if it was once alive, it can in fact be composted in the right conditions and environment. A backyard bin requires you to be perhaps a little bit more pickier in terms of what you're going to compost due to the fact that the volume is not as large to get to the temperatures needed to really break down some hardier materials, or materials that typically would be easily broken down in a larger windrow or a large scale facility. A typical rule of thumb is within the backyard bin or even community bin, it's kind of a strict diet of fruits, vegetables, easy to break down carbon materials, and kind of keeping out the meats, bones, dairies, and fats for the most part, but those in fact can break down over time. I think the true heroes and sheroes of this work is not us with our pitchforks and our tumblers and just our systems, but it is in fact the macro and microorganisms. The things that we can often not see from the macroorganisms, we can see the arthropods and the worms and things that we can see with our eyes, but it's this incredible soil food web that is working to break down this organic matter into plant soluble form for our plants and root systems to really take up the nutrients that the organic matter provides. Their movement and their Hunger Games, Game of Thrones activity, so to speak, their metabolic activity really creates air pockets and structure and allows for water to really store well, which we'll get into. Starting from kind of our second trophic level, we start to talk about fungi, which are the kind of most dominant and do heavy lifting towards the end and finished and curing stages. Kind of fungal activity is kind of limited during like hot thermophilic temperatures, but these species kind of break down most of the woody material and are often in heavy carbon piles with mulch and logs and twigs. The second is our bacteria, which are dominant and do the heavy lifting during most active stages of composting. They are most accessible as well when carbon and nitrogen are properly balanced, and they're pretty abundant in multiple forms. One form of bacteria is called Actinomycetes, which many of you may have seen in your compost pile. Almost looks like kind of a white spiderwebby looking substance in your pile. That's a group of bacteria that really break down plant cellulose. They kind of create long chains similar to what we might consider a fungal hyphae. And they're responsible for kind of the fresh, earthy aroma associated with earth-smelling compost and soil. Moving on to the next, you kind of go to the protozoa and nematodes. And they're generally higher level feeders than the bacteria and fungi. And their primary source of food is bacteria and fungi, so they actually feed on them. And then we moved finally towards kind of nematodes, arthropods and worms, which are typically in the cooler final stages of composting. And good healthy soil has plenty of these per acre, per few square feet. And I just think the soil food web is really beautiful when we start to think about the networks that are created below the ground, specifically within a mycorrhizal network or lens, which we'll get into, and how that relates to us as humans in the communities above the ground. Why compost? There's a lot of reasons why compost. These are just a few, but why do we do it? Most common answer we get is to reduce food waste from landfills. There's really no such thing as a way, and specific communities often bear the burden of majority of what we consider waste. And as many of us know, when we send food scraps to landfill to compost in anaerobic conditions, they kind of create methane, a greenhouse gas that is pretty potent in regards to this conversation of climate change. Compost is not soil, but it can build healthy soil. It adds structure. It adds the ability for compost to hold itself together and prevent erosion And when it does rain, the very few days that it does rain here in Los Angeles, it does in fact improve water holding capacity in our soils. Creates that sponge-like soil floor that when it rains, water is readily available. It allows us to support our own food growing efforts by creating kind of a soil conditioner amendment locally, aware of the ingredients that went in, reducing our need for specific fertilizers because we are generating it in-house. And kind of my two favorite are these two corner ones, really keeping resources local to our community. How are we building up the health of our soil, which obviously is a transfer of life. Compost contributes to soil health. And I don't have to tell this group, but obviously soil health contributes to the plant health, which contributes to the insects and pollinators and the birds and all life around us. So how do we ensure that across all communities, not just Los Angeles, that we are allowing for these transfers of life to take place? And in my opinion, composting together builds community. It does not happen in a silo. It is not an isolated experience. It very much is a reflection of the pile and outside the pile in terms of when folks are contributing, turning, sifting, mixing, building, blending, and just coexisting well with the pile. Our grid funds at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance always come out with beautiful infographics, and I just wanted to share a few before we dive into kind of the human element of composting. Because composting impacts a lot more than perhaps we think. Because as we know, landfills and incinerators really pollute soil, air, and water, contribute to climate change, and are hazardous to both human and animals. Typically in Los Angeles County, I believe the breakdown is about 30% of what we throw away is compostable, but depending on the facilities, about half of what we throw away can in fact be composted across our country. Enhances soil and protects watersheds, as I mentioned earlier. It essentially acts as a stormwater filtration, specifically in our urban areas, and improves biological, chemical, and physical characteristics of soil when added to soil. I love this picture because it kind of shows all that it does. I love that it can hold it 5 times its weight in water, and it increases soil fertility, and it reduces the need for outside chemicals, protects soil against desertification and erosion, and it kind of keeps the soil stuck together. And I think that's the beauty of like this communal action of keeping things together, holding things together, and allowing things to thrive. It protects the climate in regards to the landfill diversion and also allowing plants to really photosynthesize really well. There's a lot of conversation and media around regenerative agriculture and what does it mean to store carbon back in the soil. And I think a lot of those studies are incredible and happening across multiple areas in Marin County, Central California. But what does it mean to like do this in an urban environment and across all our soils? And I think one of the things that we can speak of is composting creates jobs. It is in fact a career that people can engage with in terms of manufacturing composting, selling composting, and just supporting urban green spaces as well. There's a lot of things we can do outside of just composting on our own. We can encourage decentralized systems, really focused on healthy soils and green infrastructure initiatives, identifying the grants and loans and tech assistance to compost projects, and really supporting these small facilities that are happening all across the country. I show this picture, and it's a picture you'll probably see 2 or 3 times during my conversation with you all. And I say a conversation and I realize I'm just talking to you, so I apologize for that. But this is LA County. This is the home of, this is basically the most populous county in the country. There's over 10 million of us eating, drinking, and breathing. And I think there's an incredible opportunity for us to do something really special here. I mean, we already are. Amongst all of us, our friends, family, communities, and those not present. I think when I see this picture, I get encouraged about the potential, but also how our freeway systems could perhaps, if you squint your eyes, can represent this mycorrhizal fungi, this network that shares resources, that communicates well, that holds things together. And I guess I'm really encouraged about what compost is already doing in our soils, but what it can do also above the ground. I want to briefly talk about how I got into this work. As Carol mentioned, I used to be a teacher. I am born and raised here in Los Angeles and from the San Gabriel Valley specifically. But I used to teach 5th grade reading and writing. And I apologize, first of all, if you hear any background noise. I also have a 1 and a 4-year-old. But as a teacher, I would often use analogies in my classroom. One of those analogies was I had a seed in my pocket, and one day I pulled out the seed and I said that this seed represented my students' journey, in the sense that they needed a lot of things contributing to the seed in order for it to grow. They needed healthy soil, they needed water, sun, microbial activity, compost, a variety of ingredients that reflected the teacher, family, community members, and all the positive influences in their life. I talked about how the seed, when it grew, it was going to face challenges as they did. It was going to face a lot of things trying to rob its energy, its life, its joy, but that it needed to focus on its growth, and not just to celebrate itself, but what that growth represented for others within the community. How if it was a tree or a shrub, it would provide protection, how it provides essentially food, energy, and life, how it could provide shade, and that their growth just wasn't about them, but about those that it affected in a positive way as well. And just as I thought I was making some connections with my students and I saw a few heads nod, I had a student raise his hand and simply ask, "So Mr. Martinez, how does a Cheeto grow?" And I thought he was playing with me. I thought I was going to be made. It was a joke, but he was serious. And I responded, trying to be the teacher that I was, to make it a teachable moment with, "Well, where do carrots come from?" Just to try to take away from the Cheeto. And he mentioned Publix, which in South Florida, where I got to teach for a few years in Miami, Little Haiti, that was the local grocery store. And I said, "Oh, wonderful. Where does Publix get it from?" And he said, "Oh, the truck driver." And I said, "Incredible. Where does the truck driver go?" And I could see it in his eyes that he had no idea where food came from beyond that truck driver. And he kind of responded in an angry voice, like, aren't you my reading teacher? Why are we talking about food?" And it was there that it was kind of like a reality that my students were kind of landlocked to about 6-block radius. Although they were from Miami, born and raised in Miami, maybe some, not maybe some, several immigrant, like coming from Haiti after the Haiti earthquake, they would, they, they never stepped foot in the ocean, or they weren't connected to the natural world when they were naturally part of the world. And this little garden you see was nothing magnificent or beautiful. It came from like a $500 grant. But what it did was allow students to make connections and to construct their own knowledge and to facilitate conversation and to talk things through and see food come from the ground and see why leaves turn yellow and how soil contributed to just life itself. This garden's still going to this day, and I'm just incredibly grateful for the teachers and just the school district and just school gardens and teachers as a whole across the country. It's a profession that doesn't get enough love and attention, and I am so grateful for my teachers and all of you who are teachers to this day. Coming back to Los Angeles, I really wanted to experience this transformative understanding of just food and the full story of food and how food impacted us in all of its stages and journey. So I called all my friends and family who had bicycles. I bought them bike trailers. I had some friends who worked at In-N-Out, and instead of In-N-Out throwing away their pickle buckets, I repurposed them all, put some stickers on them, and worked with a few restaurants in the San Gabriel Valley to collect about 30,000 pounds of food scraps in about 4 months. The food scraps we collected, I built bins in my friends' and family's backyard. And the compost that we created, we gave away at farmers markets in our early years. And the donations we received from those farmers markets, we just built school gardens with. And I had the honor of kind of working in some of the schools that I got to attend. So this was actually my elementary school in West Covina, the school whose teachers taught me how to read. We're still teaching to that day, and really encouraged about this full circle experience that I was a part of. There was a lot of attention that we got, but we also got a friendly call saying, "Hey, what you're doing is awesome. It's also illegal." We weren't allowed to move material on bike because we didn't have specific permits, waste handler permits, so on and so forth. And I also realized at that point it was a good moment to reflect. I'm born and raised in San Gabriel Valley, home to one of the largest landfills in the country back in the day, the Puente Hills landfill. I was getting calls from Venice, Eagle Rock, Inglewood, about folks that wanted us to pick up their food scraps, but obviously that was not going to happen on bike. So it was a moment for us to rethink how we were going to work, how we were going to operate, and how we were going to engage individuals, not in just this drop off feel good program, but an more engaged model. So we received a small grant from the church I attended in Monrovia, and we kind of resurrected an old sports equipment graveyard into just, again, nothing thrilling and exciting, but a 10 raised bed community garden with some compost bins. The students collected food scraps from the cafeteria. Some, like these two sisters here, their mother was actually the head of the cafeteria, so it was an incredible family effort. Compost was created, helped the food that we grew, gave away at farmers markets again, and just kind of told people about what we were doing. This was about 2013. We had about 4 hubs, as Carol mentioned, one at the Natural History Museum, demonstration one at USC, one at a Collective Arts Swimming Center, and then another like at a high school. And the idea was to compost on site, and whether it was a school, church, museum, community garden, really engage with individuals in the full story of food and how their individual efforts can have kind of a domino effect across the most populous county in the country. We grew and worked with LA Conservation Corps, taught those students how to build our bins, and started to capacitate and rebuild old bins that were kind of falling apart all across the city with some early city funds. And in the same way we looked at LA and Soil Food Web and just how networks work together, our work was very collaborative. It grew into a network of hubs across LA County that every single space that we entered was in partnership with an existing community, organization, nonprofit, or group of folks who built a level of trust and transparency with the folks that were around them. It was a school, a housing project, an HOA apartment, a commercial kitchen, a vacant property, a garden center. And what we did, what was really incredible, is we actually hired from the community. I obviously couldn't do this work alone. And what better folks to help facilitate the growth of the neighborhood than an individual who's born and raised in that neighborhood. So I started to hire compost managers to really facilitate the growth and engagement and collaborative efforts of community croaks across the city. It was another moment of reflection in terms of identifying how we operated and what we were going to do. This is another incredible graphic by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance that kind of showcases the hierarchy to reduce food waste and grow community. There's one that the EPA puts as well, and theirs kind of talks about food recovery and incineration, and other folks and composting kind of on the bottom rung of the ladder. I really like this one because it focuses on the various scales of composting and building soil. As much as I will preach the gospel of compost, I will always ensure that food that can get to people who can eat it should get to people who can eat it, as well as animals. Composting is the last effort before a landfill, but also an effort that contributes to soil health and community, keeping resources local to our community. LA Compost, we really, in 2017, identified the fact that we were focusing on the individual, community, decentralized network, and medium scale at parks, urban farms. And we were going to operate in these 3 tiers and only these 3 tiers. So I'm going to kind of briefly go through our 3 tiers now and talk about our work and how we're moving forward and how we're building healthy soils, healthy communities, and resilient communities through these collaborative efforts. We established some contracts with municipalities such as the City of Burbank to teach a lot of their workshops. We worked with the City of LA and their Food Waste Task Force to pilot a program similar to New York, where we collected food scraps at farmers markets, backed by LA Sanitation as far as having this be a pilot program. First few weeks, we had about 6 families, and now we get about 400 families dropping off within a 4-hour period, capturing about 4,000 pounds of food scraps that are all composted locally. Another thing that was incredible was how our compost managers knew the neighborhood in such an incredible way. They saw the changes to the neighborhood, the development of their neighborhood, and knew their neighbors by name and spaces and the history of their spaces. I want to give a brief snapshot of our regional coordinator, Jonathan Galindez from South Los Angeles, born and raised in and around this community, now managing a hub at the middle school he attended. What we wanted to do was not just focus on community hubs, but what would it mean to support and capacitate individual soil farmers, especially in this time of COVID and how we must quarantine? What would it look like for people to build their soil, have a green space that there is their own, but be a part of a network where they are sharing resources, knowledge, engaging in dialogue with their neighbors, capacitating their parkways, vacant lots, side, front, backyards, and not just saying, here's your seeds, here's your compost bin, here's your tree, but here's your hub right across the street. Here's your compost facilitator to assist you along the way. When you need mulch, you can come here. When you need seeds, you can come here. Seedlings, compost, overs, anything, not like knowledge-based sharing. And we really engage in this process of what does it look like to truly engage the community and allow the community's voice to lead conversations and allow their lived experience to dictate program offerings. Before, I was on kind of just building hubs because I felt that it was needed. And I was building without really planning. And I think now we're really taking a step back to pause and kind of focus on this 3C model, which is called Conocer, Compartir y Co-crear, which stands for how do we get to know? How do we participate and engage? And how do we co-create community-based solutions with the community's voice present in these conversations? This neighborhood soil farmer program launched last year. And what we learned was that people, regardless of neighborhoods, want to grow, whether it's in boxes and baskets that they find on the side of the road, if it's finding umbrellas that they find on the side of the road to create shaded areas. They want a green space just like all of us here. And what would it look like to create a shared economy across neighborhoods that often don't have the tree canopies that other neighborhoods have, or beautiful lush green spaces on sidewalks that others have, and put the resources and power back in their hands to do that in this individual door-to-door approach. Jonathan recently welcomed his son into the world about a year ago, and I just think it's so beautiful that those that were present at his baby shower were not just friends and family, but those he engages with at the Soil Farmer program, as well as the cooperative hubs that we're going to talk about. Early on, we created hubs that served kind of as drop-off points. These were at schools, at parks, community gardens, churches. And early on, people would kind of come, weigh their materials, write their name, the date, and drop off their food scraps. And we would showcase the collective impact. But the majority of the work was still falling on the shoulders of our compost managers. And in the same way, early on, as we collected food scraps on bike and composted, we still felt like we weren't doing enough in terms of engaging the individual in a way that truly allowed them to participate fully. So a few years ago, we transitioned our regular compost hub model to a cooperative model. This cooperative model allowed individuals to drop off as long as they kind of signed this cooperative agreement that mentioned that they were going to volunteer X amount of hours per year. And it was minimal. It was like 4 hours for the year. And if they didn't volunteer, they didn't get kicked out. But the premise and the intention was that it was a collective effort, that the browns and the layering and the sifting and the turning and the watering and the repair and maintenance was across the network of folks dropping off and not just a single individual. We saw great success pre-COVID in this program, so much so that we had a hub in downtown that was kind of leaned against a parking garage. And one night there was a car that actually drove through the second floor of the parking garage and landed on our compost bin. I did not add that picture in this slide deck. The individual was okay. I believe they fell asleep at the wheel, but we had to close that co-op for 2 weeks for maintenance and repairs. And the individuals dropping off were, they understood our situation, but they also rose to the occasion and simply kind of said, what can we do to get this back online? This is our outlet. This is our volunteer opportunity. This is where I bring my food scraps every other day. And they basically mobilized their collective efforts and fundraising efforts and time and energy to fix that bin basically on their own. And that to me was just like kind of like a proud moment to showcase that it wasn't just on us, but it was in fact a community that wants to see this grow, that wants to see this expand, and that they in fact have a level of ownership, investment, and appreciation for this work. And these hubs are really all over LA County. We work very closely with LA Community Garden Council, very closely with nonprofits that are just facilitating and operating green spaces. And we would mobilize and facilitate plenty of workshops at each of these hubs to ensure people understood best management practices, encourage folks to compost on their own, but understand how this was a community effort. And it was just incredible to see people gather and be engaged and really enjoy this process with their neighbor, and also just be proud that this was in their community and a space that they were greening within their community. We are about to launch our Compost Cultivator program, which is basically how our co-op members can step up and kind of step into leadership opportunities as well. Imagine it similar to a TA moving to adjunct professor. This is kind of our approach to mobilize the human network of Angelinos across the county to really engage in this work in a deeper, more thoughtful way. So we have our individual approach, which is kind of workshops, soil farmer, and our food scrap drop-off at farmers markets. We have our community effort, which is our community drop-offs and our co-op program across the county. And then we have our regional effort. And the only difference between a regional and community hub is space, capacity, and kind of partners that we work with. We oftentimes work with food recovery agencies who have done such an incredible job this past year during COVID and food insecurity on the rise. And oftentimes when they get materials and drop it off to a partner organization, there's a lot of materials that have gone bad or spoiled or rotten. And rather than the agency having to front the bill to dump them, we kind of come alongside and either create on-site composting solutions or local drop-off solutions when we can. This one is in South Los Angeles at Fremont High School, which was in partnership with the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. An incredible space that had a greenhouse, native garden, raised beds, orchard, some vermicompost benches, and now windrows taking place that was managed by their after-school GAP program. This location was the Audubon Center at Debs Park, really working with local food recovery agencies and local food scrap drop-offs that are coming from farmers markets to engage corporate businesses, church groups, engaging with scout troops, and really just allowing people to just engage in this incredible experience of seeing transformation happen before their eyes. We have it at various community gardens. And as I mentioned, my favorite type of composting is just windrow composting, for people to see the steam, to see the transformation, to see the layering and the different, how quickly things decompose, but how you can stick your face 10 inches away from the compost pile and not smell nothing but good earth. And there's also studies show that there's certain bacteria in the pile that actually almost serve as antidepressants or just serve as natural, good, happy feeling bacteria within our just mental and physical health. We pre-COVID had an Earth Day event where essentially we invited the community to engage and experience the full story of food in every phase of composting. And it doesn't matter if you're 4 or 104, there was something for everyone to engage and participate in. Vermicompost sifting, checking out the soil food web under the microscope, and just seeing the different process. I think there's something really beautiful about working with youth across the city, in the sense that our youth are very overstimulated and spend most of their time on a screen that kind of dictates how they absorb information. And I think whether they're wearing gloves or barehanded in the compost, there's this beautiful transfer of life that's taking place when they are touching and engaging with this. I oftentimes kind of like to put a few hundred worms or a few worms in a child's hand or a high school student's hands and see their reaction, but allow for them to pause and almost recalibrate their own internal system to remember that they are not separate from nature. They are not separate from this earth, but they are nature. That the suffering that this earth is experiencing or the healing and restoration that this earth is going to experience is also part of their own healing and restoration. One of our regional hubs is at an incredible urban farm in Panorama City, San Fernando Valley, an area that has been heavily impacted by the waste industry over the past few years. Cottonwood Urban Farm doing incredible work, gathering folks every Saturday, creating, and these pictures are pre-COVID, hence the no masks, but and lack of social distancing. But this space is an incredible space to engage community. Elliot and Vane are doing Market Zero bags where They're working with local organic farmers to get fresh produce to local community partners such as Pacoima Beautiful and others in the area, and are offering up open compost hours for people to just volunteer and engage. I want to say that this work isn't just a hobby or something that I feel like is a trend. We worked with the city of LA to showcase that there is great potential with community composting, that state and federal funding should not just go to large scale industry or infrastructure, but we mapped out every community garden, pocket park, nursery, school garden to show that in the city there are plenty of spaces for community composting and cooperative composting to take place. Last year, we were fortunate to be written into the Mayor's Green New Deal plan here in the city of Los Angeles, specifically as a partner initiative. But what was really exciting was that some of the work that we were doing was written explicitly as some of the milestones that they wanted to reach. So this is of course pre-COVID, but establishing food scrap drop-off locations at all city farmers markets, partnering with local organizations to ensure food scraps are composted locally first. That came out of our pilot program, and it is now a goal to launch across all 60 farmers markets, and not just send what we collect to an anaerobic digester outside our county, but build the infrastructure that's needed. So here it says, developing the composting master plan to expand community and regional composting infrastructure and making sure people are aware of. It's great when cities have citywide composting. It's also great when there's infrastructure to keep those resources local. We recently introduced a motion here in LA at the city council level, which we are hoping to keep moving forward, called Regenerate LA, a strategy to really reimagine how our park spaces can be utilized to compost and just serve as a place for distribution in partnership with Tree People, City Plants LA, and other local NGOs, where we distribute trees, but also with compost and mulch to ensure those trees survive. We distribute native plants in partnership with the Audubon Center at Debs Park. And how do we see park spaces as spaces that are naturally teeming with life and eliminating glyphosates and other sprays that we just don't want on these park grounds? And the same call that we received early on that said what we were doing was kind of not allowed, 7 years later created a grant to support this work across the state of California. So LA Compost helped start the California Alliance for Community Composters, which is allowing us to capacitate spaces from Sacramento down to San Diego. The state of California wanted to see 50. We got roughly over 150 applicants, and really showcasing the demand and the excitement for this work. In my last few minutes, I just kind of want to share the beauty that this work has on the human spirit and just the humans that gather. This right here is one of our more active hubs in a housing project in Mar Vista Gardens, where several family members gather to create their own growing space and kind of help change the law of HACLA to allow for food to grow in housing project areas. They're building their soil and they are working collaboratively to do this work. And I think the beauty of composting is just that it really, it's an embodiment of community. It requires a diversity and imperfection of ingredients to really thrive and to move forward in a really incredible way that doesn't pause to ask to be celebrated, but really just wants to give itself away once complete, and really is an embodiment of death, life, and regeneration. During COVID, we saw, I guess, one silver lining was the fact that as people were staying home, they were cooking more, visiting their green space or garden, and we were able to work with local partners to give a few thousand seedlings away each month and create little compost tea bags and just have a presence in the community even during this time of COVID. Allow for a single volunteer to work with the compost manager and still do the physical work, and even transition from our farmers market food scrap drop-off to more of a socially distanced drive-up drop-off model at a location that was close to our farmers market. This was our team pre-COVID. There's a few more faces to this team now. But I think what's beautiful about what I really am proud of our team is the fact that they are a reflection of the city. Each of them are from a different area of LA, have an incredible story, lived experience that they bring to the table, and really allow, in the same way I was able to facilitate conversation and knowledge sharing as a teacher, they allow for that to happen because we are not the masters or the experts or the know-all individuals. We are learning by doing, and the reason why we get to facilitate this work is because of our mistakes. But I think the beautiful thing, as many of us know about gardening and composting, is that it is very forgiving. It almost always creates something of value, no matter how bad or perhaps imbalance. You always can perhaps repair that rupture. And I just kind of will always sing the praises of LA, having been born and raised here. But I think I often say that the beauty of a compost pile kind of comes from the collective imperfections and diversity of its ingredients. And I think the beauty of LA and many of our communities come from the people who call it home and are proud of their city and proud of their neighborhoods. And we run this little campaign pre-COVID called Composters of LA, where we basically take a portrait profile of an individual, ask for their zip code, ask why compost, and just really love to see the diversity of answers, from simple answers of why not to a basically dissertation of the importance and value in sacred act of composting. Before we kind of close off, I kind of want to just read something to close out our time together that kind of hopefully brings it all together in terms of health, community resilience from soil and people. And it's a letter I kind of wrote at the end of last year to kind of reflect on compost and just the year that we've experienced and the time in which we are living in. And it goes, out of all the words I try to think of when I describe this past year, the word compost keeps coming to the top of my mind. I don't want to limit this word to the actual end product that comes out of a backyard bin or community pile. I want to speak a bit more about what this word and overall process represents and how it relates to this past year. Compost is death, life, restoration, grace, compassion, diversity, and so much more, created through a beautiful and sometimes messy process. It accepts what some may consider broken, imperfect, waste, and no longer having value, and allows for this collection of ingredients to go through a transformative process. This process is not quick or easy and requires both patience and change to get to the desired outcome. Temperatures rise, difficult interactions increase, and the synthetic items that once held life together prior to entering the compost pile are exposed as contaminants that must be removed. Essential ingredients such as water and oxygen are needed to allow the pile to breathe and regulate temperature. And the pile must rest, cure, or mature before moving this energy. Once complete, compost is not asked to be celebrated or praised. It is simply ready to give itself away to the next cycle of life for future growth. Compost is an embodiment of resilience as it contributes to health and wholeness within a living system. It creates a diverse network of partners who communicate, hold material together, and share resources to other living organisms when one is in need. Although compost is often known for its life-giving qualities below the ground, I'm encouraged with the way that it has transformed life above the ground as well. This past year, we've experienced loss, witnessed death, dealt with pain, and have seen suffering on multiple levels. We've also witnessed neighbors sharing, community members standing up for others, transfers of life taking place daily, and the joy of knowing that systems and ideas, just like food scraps and mulch within a compost pile, can be transformed. In the same way that compost requires balance with its ingredients and overall environmental conditions, we also require this balance. My hope is that we may all continue to invest in self-care and social connection to allow for our own compost journey to continue. May we have grace for ourselves as we navigate each day, knowing that we are a part of a larger human network. And with that, I simply want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for letting me share a little bit about our work, a little bit about why I think composting is important, and kind of where we're going. And super appreciative for just the space to share and gather with you all.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was such a great presentation. And I think your mission as well is absolutely important right now, especially in LA, being the most populous county in the entire US. So keep up the good work. I think you're doing great. We do have a few questions already and some comments. So if you're ready, let's start with the Q&A portion. Let me get these ready. And if anyone's watching on Facebook Live as well, please feel free to add your comments and we will answer those too. So Michael, whenever you're ready, I'll have you turn your microphone and your video back on. All right, perfect.
I think
So
I'm still not able to start my video for some reason.
here we go.
There we go.
You should be able to. All right, no worries. So this first question is from Martin B, and it's a kind of a comment first. Some cities internationally have pickups of organic material in communities with lots of apartments where people can't recycle their food waste. I wonder if you were aware of any initiatives to encourage a fourth container for pickup by the city, organic waste, or should we be encouraged to place it in the green bin? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so it's different for every municipality, but I'll speak to the LA experience here, specifically LA Sanitation, which services about 750,000 single family homes. So the green bin that we have here in LA can take fruits and vegetables that perhaps were fallen from our tree or our garden that we turned over between season, but technically we should not be putting table scraps or meal prep material in those bins, because these materials are getting sent to facilities that unfortunately are not yet permitted for accepting food waste. The city of LA last year has piloted a program across all council districts and distributed across 18,000 homes these pails called Curb Your Food Waste, where Martin, they literally allowed folks to put their food scraps in this little bin, take it to that green bin, and the specific routes that were part of that pilot program went to an anaerobic digester facility in Paris, California. I have seen obviously cities like San Francisco and Austin and New York prior to the changes kind of work on this citywide approach. I know for LA, we're working on it because we are going to have to, which is legislation, specifically Senate Bill 1383, Assembly Bill 1826. I think the issue is infrastructure. Infrastructure at the large scale in which is required for citywide systems takes several years to build. And I think that's why we want to kind of focus on all levels of infrastructure, the individual backyard composter, the community composter, the park composting at parks, and working with these haulers and municipalities. So I know the city of LA was and is trying to establish citywide composting, and I know for a fact that it will in fact happen. It's just a matter of that infrastructure possibly catching up with the organics that will eventually be collected from those routes.
Well, here's something similar to that as well that might tie into your answer. Martin also asks a related question: can LAUSD and other school districts get behind a composting system? They throw away a lot of food. I know school principals who resisted compost bins because of anxiety about rats taking advantage. But your bins look pretty secure.
Yeah, we kind of play for our 3 bins, which are typically at schools, that we kind of level the ground and put like these 1x1 pavers to really prevent anything from burrowing underneath. And then we use like 2x6, 2x4 redwood that is pretty sturdy, and we kind of repair and replace that. And then we use 1/4-inch mesh because mice and small vermin can still get through 1/2-inch mesh, as we learned early on. But it's all about just like, how are we creating optimal conditions to ensure that we are not having food scraps exposed or never not covered. But I would love it if LAUSD kind of got behind these efforts. It is a little difficult because I think there's some just legal barriers of, as soon as a child gathers an apple or gets an apple, like it either has to be thrown away or shared. I don't know. I know that shared tables were really picking up steam pre-pandemic, which was incredible, meaning that if when students were forced to kind of take 3-4 items and they only ate one of them, rather than throwing those away, kind of creating a shared table for those that were still hungry to then pick up more items and so on. And I think composting at schools is definitely on the horizon, similar like composting at parks, but I'm really encouraged about composting at schools because that's kind of how it all started for me. And I know there's a lot of incredible organizations from Enrich LA, Garden School Foundation, these just incredible groups and schools operating on their own that are really invested in a holistic educational experience for their youth. So yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, before we continue, we are actually, I'm going to have one question from Facebook Live. This one's from Drew. Has anyone studied the level of E. coli in industrial green waste facilities versus community composting operations? With so much less quality control in green waste trash cans, it would seem like a great argument for smaller, more distributed community-led efforts versus industrial ones.
I'm not aware of those studies. I know that there are studies specifically just in regards to contaminants. For perhaps some of us that have seen like kind of like these mulch piles across the city, they're not perfectly clean, and that's not the fault of the city. It's just the way in which we assume things will just go away, right? But it's oftentimes you'll see plastic and just trash in these piles because of the level of contamination, where I feel like at the community level, because it's dealt by hand and we literally are turning with pitchforks and can see everything that we're processing, we're able to kind of control what we're accepting. And we do send our finished compost to different labs just to get tested and see the results to ensure we are not just spreading something that's going to negatively impact these growing spaces. We're actually working on kind of like a community science lab that will have a series of microscopes to allow people to work with soil scientists on our team that went to school and has her master's kind of like in soil science and composting, and really just make it chewable and tangible for folks to be confident and understand the life cycles of soil and the importance of compost in that conversation.
Oh, that's such a neat initiative. Well, okay, before we keep going with more questions, we do have a few more. I will say that if anyone needs to go, please note that we will have this recording on our website towards the weekend, but you're also going to be receiving an email with the recording, and you can always go to socalhort.org for any of our recordings, or visit our YouTube channel as well. If you type in SoCalHort, you'll be able to find us. So if you do have to go, before you do that, we are going to do our door prize, which is the 2 free tickets to the Theater Payne Native Plant Garden Tour. And I'm going to get my screen ready so we can get our wheel of names going, which we haven't done in a while, so this is going to be exciting. All right, let's see who will be our lucky winner tonight. Kristen, hey, you are our winner. Are you still here, Kristen? Kristen, look for your hand. Oh, I don't see Kristen here. Okay, we're gonna do one more. All right, let's see. Marty C. Marty, are you in the audience? I see you, Marty. I will reach out to you. I will email you with all the information, okay? So thank you for participating. Thanks for joining us tonight, guys. And if you do need to go, make sure to mark your calendars for next month too, because next month on May 13th, we are going to be hosting the Fiber Shed founder and author, Rebecca Burgess, on native plant pellets, creating dyes from our fiber shed. So that will be really interesting. Make sure to keep an eye out for our registration link and all of our social media and our website updates as well, which will have all the information. And likewise, if you have benefited from tonight's webinar or any of the content that we share online, please consider donating something to our organization. Much of our revenue comes from our in-person events, which we are going to be starting up again this summer. I am so excited for our first Coffee in the Garden event happening in July. So keep your eyes out for those details too. But in the meantime, before we have those in-person events, know that your contributions actually help power our Zoom webinars too and help keep them free. And so anything that you guys contribute is always appreciated. But even better than making a donation, become a member of the SoCal Hort Society. We have memberships as low as $10 a year, and you get access to all the great content that we share already, but also you do get discounts on some of our in-person events. So it is worth it to become a member and support our organization. So thank you again for anyone who has to go. We are going to continue with our questions. So let me stop sharing my screen. And we'll keep going. All right. Michael, this one is from Yoav. I assume compost systems that contact the ground below are more successful due to the soil providing a source for organisms than bins that are raised off the ground. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, that's right. When we talk about like our backyard systems, if you had an option to put it on bare soil, such as like municipal plastic bin that cities and counties distribute, if you had an option to put it on bare soil or brick, cement, asphalt, concrete, or hard surface, soil is great to allow for that transfer of life and interaction to take place. I've actually seen people kind of move their compost bins every year from one part of the yard to the right or left, and that becomes their future planting area because it's just basically inoculating that soil and creating some structure below that soil. So you are correct. There are some places where we kind of just have to create a barrier below, such as the 3 bins with the pavers. But yeah, if you have an option to just do bare soil, it's wonderful. It's great.
And Yoav has a couple other questions. How are the community volunteers trained when they are committed to only 4 hours per year? Apparently, there still has to be a compost manager always present to train and supervise.
Yeah, so the training that we mentioned is a new program that we're launching called Compost Cultivators that we haven't even started yet. We're currently accepting application, and that training will span 3 months of working in close proximity with the compost manager, to which they'll be able to host and lead their own events. The co-op members that are asked to volunteer about 4 hours a year, which is just a minimal ask, are present with compost managers, but we're not expecting them to run the whole show, just to be a participant. So there is a difference between the Compost Cultivator program that we're launching next month and just a co-op member, which is just working alongside a compost manager.
Nice. And the last question from Yoav. I didn't hear you say much about worm bins. Do any of your community hubs or training workshops involve worm bins?
Yeah, so we have a few where almost all of our regional hubs have flow-through worm systems. So systems that are like 6x4 and have like a cutting bar that kind of separates the castings from the bedding. We do teach vermicompost workshops, and we used to be part of kind of LA County smart gardening workshops, which are now online, and they have vermicompost workshops as well. That's typically something we teach after people kind of get the hang of just typical backyard composting, but people typically sometimes skip backyard composting, go straight to worm composting because they know the benefits of castings. They're perhaps in a small space that they have the shade and can keep it cool. But I think worm composting is incredible if it can work well at schools as well, just from the level of engagement and excitement that students have when they see worms and they learn about worms, and the fact that worms don't have eyes or teeth and really can't harm them, and just kind of the cool factors about worms. And yeah, worms are great. I very much am an advocate and supporter of all types of worm systems and all things worms.
All right. The next one is from Elise. My compost is in a tumbler and it's very dry. When I add water now, it doesn't seem to stay. Is there any way to salvage it?
Yeah, I'd imagine it's not staying because there's quite a few gaps or a lot of vent holes. What I've seen people do is kind of put like 27-gallon totes or trays underneath tumblers so that as they add water, it doesn't just leak out and drain to the soil, but it leaks out and kind of is captured in a mini rain barrel, so to speak, that can be used for their garden or to re-water their compost bins. I've actually seen more problems with people keeping their their tumblers are too wet because of the lack of aeration. A banana peel or a leaf clogs up the little vents and it just kind of goes anaerobic. But yeah, I don't have a ton of guidance for that outside of just like capturing any water that leaks out to continue to re-inoculate or re-pour back into that tumbler. Sorry.
Thank you. The next one is from Marcella. Are there any environmental disadvantages to anaerobic digesters? Also, school food from USDA food programs should not have an issue with composting. As a food program coordinator, the food just can't be taken home.
Wonderful. Yeah, I would say anaerobic digesters are a form of capturing and processing food scraps. I think they are kind of like are viewed as the next shiny object because they can capture methane and convert to natural gas, which can kind of power more vehicles. But I think from a composting perspective, we very much are a believer in like soil health and the importance of soil health and what that does. And I think when it comes to anaerobic digesters, it's very much like converting a natural gas, like using it for transfer the methane to natural gas. But that finished, I don't want to say sludge, but that end product that they use, I wouldn't call it compost. And also anaerobic digesters require guaranteed feedstocks to sometimes be like not just profitable, but make financial sense. And I think if our goal is to waste less, then sometimes it isn't the best option. But I see them in the system, and I know they're holding it down in incredible ways right now. I just think that diversity of systems is required for this to be successful across all levels.
The next question is from Jennifer. There is a worm composting system called SubPod that originated in Australia. Do you have any comments? Do you know if it's effective?
Yeah, so I personally haven't used it, Jennifer, but we are going to actually purchase about 10 of them to pilot in our soil farmer program. I know the SubPod basically is like a container, and then it has a raised bed around it. So the intention behind it was you would add your food scraps and compost in the same very area where you're growing food, all in one. And I think the raised bed is like galvanized steel, so it's like aesthetically nice. And then the worm bin itself is kind of hidden behind the growth of the garden. So Jennifer, I've seen it, I've heard about it. I personally, nor my team has not used it, but we will in the next 6 months. So you can circle back with us or check in with us to hear our experience with them.
Oh yeah, and post it online, tag us in it as well, and we'll be happy to share too as an update on the presentation that we had too.
Wonderful.
All right, well that is so far all of the questions that we have. We have a lot of comments thanking you. They loved the last poetic saying that you made right before ending the webinar. And yeah, this has been great. We also have a comment from Louisa saying that LA Compost installed bins at Carthay Elementary Magnet School. So they compost lunch leftovers there. So that's great to hear too, to see other people. You really have come full circle.
Yeah, but yeah, I just, it's the human network that I think is going to make this happen, and it is making it happen. So yeah, thanks again for just letting me share a little bit of our story.
Yeah, of course. Well, we do have one last question from Scott. Are grubs in compost bad? Do you remove them before you use them in beds?
So the only grubs, so just to clarify, are grubs in compost bad? That's the question.
Yeah.
The only grub that I remove just for people's fear of grubs is like the fig beetle larva. It's kind of just like the white grub with the red face that kind of looks a little intimidating per se. But I also just remove them because we typically compost near chickens, and it's like just great protein for the chickens. But those are the only grubs that I typically remove, just because I've never had a good experience with kids like seeing those and wanting to be close to the compost pile. But it's all part of like the macroorganisms of just life. But that's the one grub I see in a few windrows, and that's just the larva stage of like the shiny fig beetle larva, essentially. But that's the only one I remove. And if I were to leave it, I don't imagine it having any negative impact as well.
Well, Scott does agree. He said that's the one that is creepy. But what about earthworms?
Leave them. They'll typically be in your piles like after the thermophilic hot process. They're going to be kind of like the last to come in. I wouldn't say add worms, let them come as they come. But yeah, earthworms are going to make great passageways. They're going to allow that material to go through their gut and kind of poop out some incredible castings that are just going to add a lot of value to your soil.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. That is all of our questions and our comments so far. Did you want to add anything else before we sign off?
No, I'm excited for your all's next panelists. I think FiberShed's doing some really incredible work, and yeah, happy to hear that Rebecca's going to be sharing, and that you all are going to get to engage in conversation with her as well. So thanks for the time today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for sharing with us. And hopefully a lot of people can come and start volunteering for LA Compost too and getting more involved.
I'd love to have you as things open up again. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, Michael. Have a good night. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And again, keep your eyes out for our next webinar, which will be next month. All right, have a good one, everyone.